Hello, all you current and future meteorologists with daddy issues. Top your gas off, watch those soft drinks, roll your maps, and blast the most adrenaline-pumping music from your playlist, because Julie is ready to marry a lot more than your penis. Welcome back to Horror Convos. I'm your host, Keith Harris, and if nothing I just said made any sense to you, congratulations. You now have an idea of how I feel living with this neuroatypical brain of mine every single day. It feels so seen.
We've all grown.
Horror Convos is a casual, relaxing, and occasionally funny podcast where we choose one topic per episode and discuss whatever media we want that's related to the subject. Movies, series, literature, video games, nothing is off limits here. I then give my personal history, thoughts, and opinions on that topic, including examples that I believe portray it effectively versus not as effectively. I often have guests join in the conversation, and we hold regular polls for you to vote on what subject is covered in our Patreon exclusive For the Fans episodes. If ads are the kind of thing you dislike passionately enough to drive into the damage path of a giant funnel cloud just to watch them disappear, you can enjoy the full podcast ad-free, among other exclusive content, on Patreon. Horror Convos is available to listen to on YouTube, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts, so be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you can keep track of when our newest content is uploaded, as easily as you can track a storm on that good old Doppler radar. Today's episode has us dodging everything in our path as we hold on to something for dear life and charge with vigorous anticipation into
Suck Zone.
That's right, this is the first episode of what will be another recurring discussion, Horror of Weather, and today's topic is tornadoes. This subject will cover every scary, intimidating, and/or destructive meteorological event that reminds us just how tiny, fragile, and ultimately virtually powerless we are in the face of larger forces. I don't know about you, but I've learned to never underestimate the impossible. To paraphrase the hilariously killed-off Andrew Faschbach from 2013's World War Z,
flawless pronunciation.
With a cherry on top from They Live's George Nada, Mother Nature is a serial killer. No one's better or more creative. She can be a bitch when she wants to be, and you'd best show some respect when she's back in heat. So, for about an estimated 2/3 of my childhood, even into my teenage years, I was terrified of tornadoes or twisters, cyclones, whatever's most common for you to call them wherever you live. They're the earliest memory I have of being truly deeply afraid of something that exists in the real world. The second earliest example would be my fear of sharks that started with Jaws. The difference is Jaws did not portray sharks accurately, and at least some people who studied them knew that. Like, rogue shark theory was discredited well before 1975. That was a fraudulent theory whose whole concept held little to no water among those who were actually educated in sharks. So the movie just happened to come out at the right time when most general audiences were very ignorant on the subject. Shark films are still successful today, even with everything we've learned. But I do feel like the timing of when Jaws came out facilitated that popularity and success going forward, even as we gained more knowledge. The average kid in school thankfully learns just how much Jaws got wrong, despite being so entertaining as a work of fiction. You know, Peter Benchley himself said that had he known about sharks what he learned later, or what he knew back then, and he never would have written the thing. And yes, shark prejudice does still persist today, but on average, most people in current generations who see shark movies are at least aware going in that they're not expected to take it seriously, like so many unfortunately bought into Jaws as if it were a documentary. Tornadoes are a different story in that however horrific they're presented to be in fiction, typically isn't far off from how scary they are in real life. I was scared of everything about them growing up. How they look, sound, move, how powerful they are, their size, how they can shred just about anything in their path like toilet tissue. Ooh, and worst of all, I was chilled to the bone by real-life stories of people who had not only been close to a twister, but sucked up and carried inside of it. Oh my god, if you ever get the chance, please look up the story of that baby carried for I think a mile by that F5. I forget when this happened. And supposedly it was a trailer park, and the roof off the trailer or was like torn off of it. This baby was carried around in its carriage for, I think, like half a mile to a mile. Well, thankfully, the account goes that the parents found it alive and well, and allegedly, according to them, not only was the baby unharmed, it never even woke up. I don't know how the fuck you would do that, but just the very idea of that, I couldn't tell you how many nightmares I had about exactly some variant of that scenario. Any scenario involving a twister moving in my direction, the suction pulling me off the ground or toward the funnel, the idea of being whirled around inside this enormous dark thing with no control over my body, constantly disoriented, probably unable to see anything through all the wind, the loudness of that wind, possibility of debris beating me to death, or like a big enough chunk of it, like hitting me over the head or slicing me in half, what have you. Even just recently, while preparing for this podcast, I had a dream like that a few weeks ago, actually, involving both my mom and I being carried by a funnel cloud while we were vacationing somewhere in like the Bahamas, or I think just this funnel formed clear out of a blank blue sky and just like picked both of us up. I mean, like I've read accounts of people who were sucked up saying that this is a direct quote from a book I used to read all the time as a kid. It was a picture book about different storms. I forget this person's name. I haven't seen this book in years. It's probably packed away somewhere with our old kid stuff, my sisters and I stuff. But whoever it was, they said something to the effect of, it was like being trapped in a dark cloud with a monster. God, just thinking about it now, I'm not as easily as scared as I used to be. Thankfully, I'm much calmer in most storm-related situations now. But as a kid, if I even thought about this for more than a couple minutes with the active imagination I've always had, my anxiety could shoot up so fast, and it was so much worse when the sky actually started to look bad. Like a bad-looking thunderstorm was all it took sometimes to make me tear up. It was just so foreboding. Now, thankfully, I myself have never actually seen a tornado. I've only ever seen a wind funnel in one of those controlled glass cylinders with the fans inside that spin fast enough to imitate the conditions in which the funnel would form. I think they use dry ice in it too, so that you can like see the funnel more tangibly than you would with just air. I don't recall the last time I saw an exhibit like that. It would have most likely been on a field trip in elementary or middle school, like maybe at at a science museum. I forget if they ever had that display at the Richmond Science Museum, but yeah, that's the closest I would ever want to come to seeing the real thing, obviously. I was fascinated as a kid by the physics and movements and atmospheric conditions of the funnel itself. That there was a toy that was popular for a while when I was growing up. Like I was born in 1991. These various brands of what we called miniature pet tornadoes used to be sold all over the place. I'm sure they still are in some capacity. It was such a simple toy that at first glance, I mean, you'd think that anyone could potentially make it. It was literally just a plastic cylinder with water in it that formed a whirlpool on the inside when you shook it just right. A whirlpool, when you look at it beneath the water's surface, it's basically an underwater twister, and I found them mesmerizing as a safe way to observe these funnels and make it swirl around pretty much whenever I wanted. It was almost like the equivalent of a stress ball, just something you could observe safely, having your own control over it, as opposed to tornadoes in the wild being the opposite. I loved watching natural whirlpools that would form sometimes when the water was going down the drain of the sink or a bathtub. It was almost like a magic trick to me as a little kid, and any video footage there was on TV or documentaries, anything I could watch on it at home or in science class. I still vaguely remember the first time I ever saw a video capture a bird's eye view of a funnel cloud forming in a storm, like in midair. It was fourth grade, I think. A TV was brought into the classroom. Our teacher gave a little speech introducing what the lesson was going to be on, talking about this guy who filmed the video. And I specifically remember the moment where she said, with this kind of dramatic tone-building anticipation, and what he saw was a tornado. Then she starts the VHS tape, and I remember staring at the screen. It was one of those weather cameramen who reports from a helicopter for the news, I think. His point of view is like looking at this storm as if he were almost right across from it, just barely looking down at the tornado forming, like he's a mere few feet above it. Again, I know it wasn't actually that close. I mean, I'm sure that that's just how it looked from the camera zoom. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing at first. It didn't seem real. I watched this thin funnel of dark grayish cloud. It looked thin as a jump rope from the camera's point of view. This thing is just swirling in place, growing out from the thundercloud. There was no rain or lightning. This was broad daylight. This funnel is spiraling like a snake suspended in midair. It wasn't even a solid funnel cloud yet. You could see sections of it that looked disconnected, even though the pieces were all moving in unison. And I sit here watching this scrawny thing gradually get longer, switching from the helicopter's point of view to another camera on the ground, where they capture the funnel touching down, making the debris cloud. It gradually picks up steam, getting dirtier, dustier, the funnel getting blurrier. And the video shows every stage of this storm. What started as a flimsy little cloud rope in the sky gets bigger and stronger as the storm goes on and picks up strength, moving across the ground. By about halfway through the footage, it's grown into this giant, darker, super thick cone with these, again, seemingly impossibly high walls of cloud just barreling through and tearing through everything in their path. I was both terrified and transfixed by this. I wanted to take that tape home and just watch it over and over. And I've never been able to find that same video on the internet. If I had any contact with my fourth grade teacher at the time, I mean, I doubt if she even remembers at that point. But as soon as I had access to the internet, I went down such a rabbit hole of Twister videos. My Google and YouTube search history would be filled with that shit. I was binging footage and pictures of myriad weather phenomena long before binging became a thing in our mainstream culture. If it was in a book or a documentary throughout the 90s, well into the 2000s, I probably watched it. Like, as soon as I got my first laptop, these really just ugly looking Dell laptops that you could tell were made for school, with school students in mind. They did not look, commercial, like what you'd see on display in a store by any means. I used that as much as I could. It was my first, personal internet access outside of, the family cube monitor dial-up internet from our PC at home. And I anything that didn't violate school policy, I probably watched it. Now, the closest I've currently ever been to a tornado in the wild, so to speak, was when I was around, I want to say 4 to 5 years old. Most of it's fuzzy bits and pieces in my memory now, but I was at my grandmother's house, her old house in Chesapeake. Gran saw the weather report while I was in the front yard, I think. The closest thing to a vivid memory I have was the sky. I can still picture how it was very yellow, kind of like a sunset, but it was too early in the day, and it was a very solid, not banana yellow, but almost kind of like those popsicles that you look at in the freezer, a very light, kind of cold yellow. Oh, not yellow, blue. Just you know what I mean. If you've seen the sky this color, you get it. There were strong winds blowing leaves on the ground in the street, and the clouds. I remember the clouds were darker than I'd ever seen at that age. I mean, almost black as smoke, like that smoke monster off of J.J. Abrams' Lost. It was probably partially the light or the angle I was seeing it from. I know people at different angles of the storm can see drastically different lighting and colors. I had never seen clouds that looked like that. It just instinctively looked so unnatural to me. And that's when Gran came and took me back inside. I've talked about it before about how 2 whole sections of wall in her house were just big windows, all glass with nothing but blinds covering them. So I forget most everything after that, but I believe we would have crouched down in her bathroom, which was barely big enough for 2 people. I think I sat in the tub with nothing but a curtain to cover me while she crouched on the floor. And there was a small window in there, so we still would have had to watch for debris if the wind got strong enough that it passed over the house. Thankfully, we were fine, but when it was over, I remember anytime we talked about it, Gran said she'd seen on the news that even though we never saw the funnel cloud, it passed right by us. I mean, according to her, it came right through town just beside her neighborhood. I don't believe I heard it pass. It probably wasn't that close. It was to hear the wind swirling, but it was close enough that I will never, ever, ever, ever forget that sky. Yeah, and ever since then, I did for a while have probably a legitimate phobia, at least a mild phobia of tornadoes, but at the same time, I was fascinated learning whatever I could about them, very much like Matt Hooper in Jaws. You know, he had a little too close of an encounter with that baby thresher shark that scared him half to death, and after that, he simultaneously loved and, under the right circumstances, as we saw, was scared of sharks. So, he'd get the fear of them put into him, too. Come to empathize with Brody a lot more, or with his fear of the water. But my poor little sisters, who were both born years afterward, there's a fair age gap between me and them. I mean, like, my first sister was born in 1998, the next was 2001, then the third a year after that, and we met our step-sibling, step-sister and brother, around, I think, when I was graduating high school. But my first 2 sisters sadly got the fear put into them so much worse than I did. They were never as close to a storm that dangerous, thank God. I'm the only one among my siblings to date who's ever been that close to it, as far as I know. But anytime we visited Gran or she visited us and it looked like a bad storm was coming on the Weather Channel, she made sure we knew it and were ready to move at a moment's notice. Now, I loved my Gran very much, always will. She did so much for us and doted so much on my sisters and I. I remember that time in our childhoods more than they do, I think, because I was older. But one of her bad habits that I didn't see or didn't come to notice until I got older was she was a little overdramatic when it came to storms, sometimes a lot, and I think whatever trauma she may have had, she really projected onto us, again, more so with my sisters, like a great amount of our fear of storms growing up, especially with my sisters, I think, in hindsight, came mostly from her. Anytime it rained even a little too hard, or we heard even a little thunder, if the clouds even got too dark, she was very often quick to think the worst, and I don't know what kinds of storms she may have gone through in her own childhood growing up in the mountains. I don't recall her telling us if she'd ever been through a twister closer than the one that came through Chesapeake when I was with her. It got a little annoying by the time I was a teenager, like this one time when Gran was here during admittedly a strong thunderstorm. She had the girls and I cleaning the closet out in case we had to hunker down together in there. I remember Mom coming home and we had half our closet thrown all over the floor. She was miffed about that, definitely. It wasn't nearly as bad as Gran had made it out to be that time, but I understood that it generally came from a good place. And he said, better safe than sorry. She was just very protective and proactive, and again, yeah, maybe she had her own unresolved trauma with that, I don't know. I do remember she told me once about, I think it was a friend of hers who'd been extremely close to a funnel cloud when it either passed over or brushed by a convenience store they were in. It was only for a few seconds. From how I remember her describing it, the whole store shook violently, like the worst earthquake you can imagine, short of the ground breaking open. The windows didn't break, but you could see the dark wind blowing right outside, and she did mention the way her friend said it sounded. For them, it was like if a freight train came roaring full speed on a track right beside the store, like as if the track itself was just a couple feet away from the window, and this thing was just, blowing past like a rickety bullet train. I guess something like that. I mean, they didn't have bullet trains back then, but Yeah, like I would say people's fear and hatred towards twisters, tongue twister, is more understandable in my opinion compared to the irrational hatred towards sharks. Because I guarantee you, tornadoes are responsible for more death, injury, and general suffering throughout history than sharks could ever be. It's still not healthy to waste all of your energy hating them. It just doesn't help anyone to let that negativity just rule your life, and in general that's not healthy, and life's way too short for that. Our energy is much better placed into trying to be productive, like all those in various fields of science who endeavor to learn more about the myriad things in this world that are dangerous to us, instead of merely cursing and screaming into the void about them. I know that's easier said than done when your life's been destroyed or someone you loved was taken from you. I would never look at someone who's lost their family, car, and or house to a tornado and tell them my condolences, thoughts, and prayers. But imagine how much we could learn from this thing that just ruined your life. Yeah, there's a time and place. Some people understandably don't want to hear that, and nonetheless, I have nothing but the highest respect and admiration for those brave enough to chase storms of any kind and put their own lives on the line in the interest of not only scientific curiosity, but serving the public with the goal of using whatever knowledge they get to help everyday people be safer and better prepared against these storms. That is definitely one job I could never do, no matter how much you paid me. Not for $1 trillion would I move toward the direction of even a single twister. You would have to put a gun to my head or a family member's head for me to even consider it. And even then, I might take a moment to weigh the pros and cons. Do I want to risk being killed, potentially brutally, by a roaring vortex spinning at potentially hundreds of miles per hour? Or should I just settle for a bullet to the head? That's still not an easy answer for me. Point being, to all you storm chasers out there and anyone who knows someone that does that job, consider this a public endorsement. Thank you. You guys are real life heroes. Like all you guys and girls, male, female, whatever, you are badasses. What you do is easily on par with cops, firefighters, and even the military, in my opinion, in terms of the importance and societal benefits of your work. The research that you do and painstakingly persist at, even in the face of nature's worst terrors, is a noble and vital pursuit. The data that you collect and technological advancements from it have done so much over decades for continually improving our weather warning systems. Even if you're just sitting behind a computer and you're not actually out there, what you do can save lives, and definitely already has saved countless lives in the past. It's not uncommon for storm chasers to be killed in the field, sometimes, badly, unfortunately. Again, certainly not a career choice to take lightly, and we here at Horror Convos just want to take a moment to salute every single person out there storm chasing today. Whatever your role or expertise, whether you get dangerously close to them or stay at a distance, whoever you are, just thank you all so much. Whatever you're paid, it's not nearly enough. However much funding you have, you deserve more. And if there was a medal that could be awarded to you, were it up to me, I would personally make it twice the size of the Olympic gold, the same size medal I'd give to people working in many other fields who aren't respected enough or given what they're worth in return. So yeah, here's to you. Picture me just lifting a glass like Leo DiCaprio in The Great Gatsby. Just cheers, man. But I think on a psychological level, what always unnerves me about twisters, apart from their size and power, I think it comes down more to just the way they look and move. It's a very unique type of storm in that it looks like it's bringing the clouds down to physically touch the ground, and it can look so much more solid than mist or fog. It's a wild illusion. You see, like I said before, this rope or cone connected to both the heavens and the earth like a tether or an anchor. It's really eerie to watch that funnel do what it does, especially the closer you get, obviously. And I think this is at least partially because our primal brains, the part of our primitive brains that evolved to help us recognize and avoid predators or general danger, but especially predators, you look at this thing and the movement tricks your brain into almost perceiving that it's alive. It's like Anne Heche's character said in 1997's Volcano, talking to Tommy Lee Jones about the lava. All you can do is get out of its way. There's no Avatar Roku that's going to help you. But yeah, it's the same thing with a twister. You look at it like this gargantuan creature with, like, it has a will of its own. It's not like the uncanny valley per se. Like, I don't know if that term would fit here, but it's kind of a similar uncanny feeling. You know, our brains are notoriously just incredibly skilled at being able to perceive animation or will or personality within the inanimate, and we hear people talk similarly when you listen to them describe other acts of nature that they witnessed up close, a similar projection. And this is even more true with how we project shapes and forms onto places and things around us where our logical brains tell us that they shouldn't exist, you know, especially in clouds. I mean, we see faces, body parts, animals, messages, and so, even when they're not deliberately done sometimes, and so on. So what's the first thing you think of when imagining a tornado? Probably an elephant's trunk, right? Hanging down, sucking up everything on the ground until that impossibly huge hypothetical elephant just walking on the clouds retracts it back up. You know, would an elephant's trunk reach that long? You almost can't help it entirely. It's just instinctive visual association between two similar looking things in your mind. You know, if not a trunk, then maybe it's a vacuum hose or a tube chute you stick your letters and checks into at the world's biggest post office. And this only gets more imaginative when you introduce more complex optical illusions that are created under proper atmospheric conditions. You know, when you see a storm in just the right light or angle. But, like, remember James and the Giant Peach, that rhino inside the storm that, quote, gobbled up his mother and father? Dude, that shit scared me so bad when I first saw that movie. Like, these least favorite parts of that movie were whenever the rhino showed up on screen. But people do see things like that in storms sometimes, don't they? And the more strongly you believe you saw something, the more you project onto it with a sense of character or characterization. We see this in cultures all over the world dating back like tens of thousands of years. There are instances of this worldwide. One researcher of how tornadoes have been represented in various religions and mythologies, he's Nani Pibus. Nani? I swear it's the exact same spelling as that word. But to paraphrase her, for instance, in China, a tornado has been characterized as the wind being whirled around by a dragon, I guess by its tail, or maybe in some versions the dragon itself whirling around inside the twister, or just controlling the wind around it. I couldn't find an exact artistic reference for this. In sub-Saharan Africa, you have the Bantu people's myth of this god of light with one leg that comes down to Earth. See, a representation for people with disabilities. He's among godly figures. Here's represent. I guess we could compare that to maybe their equivalent to the giant from Jack and the Beanstalk. In Australia, you have a very similar figure, this one-legged water god, whose name escapes me. And any fans from one of these cultures listening who know these mythologies, please tell me if I get anything wrong. You know, we do try here at Horror Convos. My research team currently consists of only me, myself, and a chimp in the corner with his dick in his hand. And here in America, we have characters like Pecos Bill, the cowboy who lassoed a tornado with a snake and rode it like a bull. I remember that old story along with Paul Bunyan. And then similar legends exist among multiple indigenous tribes, like the first peoples in North America. The Cherokee tell stories of what their ancestors called the dead man walking. It's a rare but freaky-looking phenomenon wherein two or more tornadoes formed simultaneously alongside one another from a single storm will move very closely together. Some people in meteorology, I think, might nickname them sisters, and in some cases one central vortex will form. I believe this is how it happens. It starts with one central vortex forming additional, often smaller vortices around it that follow essentially the same damage path. I think there's always one vortex that I think is needed for the others to happen. In scientific terms, it's known as a multi-vortex tornado, the additional twisters being called subvortices or suction vortices. Possibly the most famous photo of the dead man walking phenomenon was the Jarrell tornado, or Jarrell, however you say it, an F5 that appeared in Jarrell, Texas on May 27th, 1997, during an outbreak of 20 reported tornadoes that just tore their way through a wide area of central Texas, mainly between northeast of Waco through northern San Antonio, which my family and I have visited before. Remember the Alamo. This particular F5, however, was unique both in the weather event that created it and how much media attention it got from a now infamous photo taken by Scott Beckwith that was published in the June 9th, 1997 issue of Time magazine. I'm going to play some audio from an analysis video on Swegel Studios, a YouTube channel run by another fellow meteorological enthusiast, Jacob Swegel. If you like watching deep dives into tornadoes or other interesting weather events, I recommend liking and subscribing to his channel, and I'll let him take it from here.
Very unique conditions involving the positions of a dry line, cold front, gravity wave, as well as high humidity helped to create a highly unstable atmosphere, which in turn led to the creation of several supercells and tornadoes. The Storm Prediction Center issued a tornado watch for eastern Texas at 12:39 p.m., and then at 3:25 in the afternoon, a small rope tornado began to drop down just west of I-35 near the town of Jarrell. The unique atmospheric conditions of the supercell allowed it to be easily visible due to both a clear atmosphere and its slow-moving nature. Most tornadoes move at speeds of 20 miles per hour. However, this tornado was only going 5 to 10 miles per hour. Due to the high visibility, many motorists on I-35 actually pulled over at a rest stop to watch this thin rope tornado slowly make its way to the southwest. But where did this myth and legend start? Where did it begin? Well, the origins of this specific photo, being called the Dead Man Walking tornado photo, can be traced to a Channel 5 documentary that aired on TLC back in 1999. About a third of the way through the documentary, they showed this clip.
An ancient Native American legend speaks of the dead man walking. If you see him in a tornado, you are about to die. The dead man has just walked into Jarrell.
If you see the dead man walking, you are about to die. Wow. Pretty terrifying. But is it even true? Is this an actual Native American legend? Well, actually, yes. I've had several Native American commenters on previous videos talk about how their grandmother or grandfather would tell them the dead man walking tornado legend. So this is indeed a story that has been retold and passed down for several generations. So what actually causes it to look like a man/monster walking? This illusion is caused by the strange, shape-shifting nature of a multi-vortex tornado. A multi-vortex tornado is a rare type of tornado that contains several powerful subvortices, aka suction vortices, within the main tornado itself. Now, usually only the most powerful EF4 and EF5 tornadoes are multi-vortex. So the legend of if you see a dead man walking, you are about to die is actually kind of based on truth, because if you're in that close of a proximity to an EF4 or EF5 tornado, you're in a really dangerous situation.
Fittingly enough, all these legends have common traits of extreme respect and reverence for the tornado. However, it's characterized or anthropomorphized, and it's understandable, as with many natural phenomena, especially those witnessed by early civilizations, why people would deify them. It's like something out of the Bible, this unstoppable leviathan destroyer of worlds that you can't possibly fight or even easily approach. Like the way it looks is it's apocalyptic.
Real wrath of God type stuff. Exactly.
All right, now it's time to get into some spoilers for examples of media that I think sell the horror of weather effectively. This is the good, the bad, and the
sucks.
So my history with seeing tornadoes on screen, I expect very likely starts at the same place it did for the majority of you, one of the quintessential classics in cinematic history and one of the most famous adaptations of a book ever made. It's a testament to the innovation of filmmaking, old school movie magic at its finest, with a story that taught us the importance of family over 60 years before Vin Diesel first jumped into a Dodge Charger. 1939's The Wizard of Oz.
You want to get sued?
Yes, the masterpiece whose critical acclaim catapulted the at-times 16-year-old darling Judy Garland to rightfully become one of Hollywood's most iconic actors to this day, and whose production pretty much sent her mental health right down the shitter. If you'd like to know more, watch the 2019 Renee Zellweger biopic drama. The behind-the-scenes accounts are well known to have contrasted the wholesome wonder of this deservedly beloved work of fiction as being one of the most harrowing productions in film history. But yeah, that movie was the first visual I was ever given to comprehend what a tornado would actually look like, and almost 32 years later, it remains the most realistic tornado I've personally seen out of any special effect in media.
It's a twister! It's a twister!
And that's especially impressive when you consider that if my film history's right, please, I've said before, feel free to correct me in the comments if I get anything wrong, or enlighten me if I don't know something. But if I'm right, I'm pretty sure there was no film footage of real-life tornadoes before this movie was made. The science of studying weather would have still been in its infancy at best. And of course, this was before public broadcasting, let alone regular weather reports, so Oz's effects artist, Albert Arnold Gillespie, had literally nothing to go off of in terms of watching something to get an idea of how twisters would move or interact with their surroundings. He and those working with them only had a few photos and possibly eyewitness accounts from whomever they could talk to that had seen a real twister. I mean, there must have been somebody in the crew who'd seen one up close in vivid detail. You know, it's hard to imagine them making something that looked this good without that. So this film crew, again, in the 1930s, not only managed to create, in my opinion, still the most convincing fake tornado in any media to date, they did it while essentially having to imagine the entire thing from a mix of still images and word of mouth. That's fucking crazy. You look into the work Gillespie did back then, he's a legend in film effects history and considered by a number of other well-known effects artists and film historians to have been a genius for his generation. And all the greats we're familiar with, like I imagine Jim Henson, Rick Baker, probably everybody at some point who worked in effects, if they didn't take inspiration from this guy, at the very least, they took a page of learning something from him. I can't imagine an effects artist who works in movies, let's say half their career, let alone their entire career, and doesn't at least know this guy's name. And the only thing crazier is how simple this effect was, at least by modern standards, to create such an authentic illusion in a time decades before even the most primitive digital effects existed. This was all practical. I'm sure plenty of Did You Know videos and other podcasts have talked about this already, but for however many of you don't know, a little trivia time here. That twister was basically a stocking. What Gillespie and the crew thought up was they took this 35-foot-long tube of a fabric called muslin. Probably more women than men already know about this. I certainly don't claim to be an expert myself. It's been a long while since I took fashion class in high school, but it's a plain weave cotton fabric, one of the oldest and cheapest fabrics. It's been used to make clothing for centuries. It comes in a variety of weights, but is commonly known for a lightweight and soft texture used in a variety of things, like some kinds of shears, sheets, drapings, things like that. It's often unprocessed and historically used a lot in fashion for mock-up garments, so artists can refine their design before transitioning to whatever fabric is used in the final product. I don't know how common that is today. It's just what I've read. If you're interested in that stuff, these little factoids I just told you here, I learned from the educational YouTube channel So Anastasia, hosted by Anastasia Chatska, a veteran fashion designer and online sewing instructor. I should probably check out more of her videos myself, get back into practice with my cross-hatching. I learned, like, at least 3 different ways to sew in that fashion class. I haven't sewn anything in so many years, not since my final class project back then where I made this ugly-ass doll for my little sister. God, she must have felt so bad for me when I gave that to her. Like, thank you. But... yeah, back to the Twister. So they have this long muslin sock with chicken wire wrapped around inside from top to bottom to spread out the cylindrical shape. They originally tried it with rubber, but that texture didn't look realistic enough. I guess maybe the lighting reflected off of it too much. So they hooked the muslin tube up to a rolling gantry at the top with, I think, a pole at the bottom with them moving in opposite directions to get that iconic snake-like funnel motion. Then they blew a fan into it while spraying something from the top and up the bottom called Fuller's Earth. From what I've read, this is a sedimentary, heavily absorbent clay-like substance. There's a few different kinds of it used for different things. It's popular in skincare, but historically it was used to get oil and dirt out of wool. The wool refinery worker who did this job was called a fuller. But they're spraying this dust all around inside, and the muslin was loose enough that it started coming out of the sides of the tube through, I guess, the little holes in the weave, which is what creates the illusion of the funnel's cloudy edges, even though in some shots the lighting behind the tube does show how solid it is, and the edge can look a little sharper than a realistic Twister would. But aside from tiny nitpicks like that, like this is peak practical effects in action. I mean, even in 2023, I've yet to see any digital tornado look this good, and this film would inspire decades of future storm chasers once that became an established practice. You know, much like how, again, Matt Hooper from Jaws motivated generations of marine biologists to study sharks. Now on to our second example of the good, and what would it be? What else? What do you think? That's right, the 1996 action-adventure, thriller, romantic, road trip dramedy, my favorite performance from the late, great Bill Paxton, and the film that made Helen Hunt one of my early celebrity crushes long before my balls dropped, one of the most unmistakable faces in media, and I 100% agree with Greg Kinnear on this.
You're why cavemen chiseled on walls.
It's funny, my first girlfriend in 9th grade, I won't name names, of course, but one thing that attracted me to this girl who would be the first I went steady with, we dated for about 6 months, like when I was, I think, 15, she was 14, up until around the end of 9th grade. Part of why I liked her was because her personality, and in retrospect, actually reminded me a little of Helen Hunt's in these movies. They didn't look anything alike. This girl was blonde at the time, similarly witty, funny, kind of dry, sarcastic. But in particular, she had a similar kind of sassiness to her. Like she was sweet, but she was no pushover or stereotypical, girly girl. She had a tomboy side, and you did not want to take an attitude with her. And I think that's one aspect I've always enjoyed about Helen Hunt's acting. She always has this spunkiness to her on screen, this often quiet and reserved, but ever present and occasionally like in your face sort of strong woman, take nobody's shit kind of vibe. But it's presented in a way that makes her likable, not toxic or gratuitous. She carries herself with this sharp-tongued wit sometimes to crack a joke, deflect from conflict, or assert herself when she gets serious or maybe defensive. You see in Twister especially, her energy very much matches and at times dominates Bill Paxton's. Her character in that movie is very much a tomboy. She's very passionately committed to her work and, not afraid to work hard and get dirty like the guys. She has a bit of wildness to her, almost like a storm herself, especially with that sometimes pretty messy hair and those bangs. Like some fans and even Helen herself have poked fun at how much her hair blows around her face in the movie, and she heard plenty of jokes, I'm sure, about why didn't her character keep it tied up in a ponytail, or why was her hair so long for this movie in the first place? Wouldn't it make more sense for a storm chaser in the field to have shorter hair? Philip Seymour Hoffman had some long hair in the film too, and at a certain point, yes, you do have to say, because it's a movie, she's the lead actress, she had to look conventionally appealing for marketing, so shut up. But again, it's a nitpick, and Helen's performance makes up for little criticisms like that in spades for me. Her character's not reduced to just a pretty face. She's extremely determined, sometimes at best recklessly so, and at worst suicidally. She's very much a leader to her coworkers and commands respect from an almost entirely male group. I imagine that was kind of progressive for the 90s, but underneath all that, at times kind of gruff exterior, her attitude and wittiness do mask a tenderness that's similarly ever-present and comes out very naturally in moments when the script requires her to convey vulnerability, fragility, inner doubts, or romantic chemistry opposite of, whomever she's acting against. Some people have criticized whether she had chemistry with Paxton or not. I thought it was palpable, and in my opinion, her strongest performances, at least in a starring role, are still Twister and As Good as It Gets, though the latter does capitalize more, I think, on her vulnerability, especially in her willingness to ultimately love and accept Jack Nicholson's character for all of his flaws as well as his virtues, even though her influence does help incentivize him to improve for his own sake as well as others.
You make me want to be a better man.
And her ability to balance those different sides of her so seamlessly and naturally really does give me a lot of respect for her, not just as an actress, but from a position of acting in general, not just from a standpoint of a female. There's nobody I've personally seen out of all the media I've watched who brings quite the same energy to a performance in the way that she does. It's also funny how Twister kind of prophesized her working with Nicholson when we see a drive-in movie in Twister playing The Shining. It's interesting to me that if you read or listen to interviews with her, she initially thought she wasn't right for the kind of movie Twister was. She wasn't known for big, like blockbuster summer-type movies, especially action flicks, but people mostly knew her at the time from the sitcom Mad About You, which I never watched growing up. I may have heard of it, and As Good as It Gets wouldn't release until the year after Twister. To me, I can't easily imagine anybody but her as Joe Harding. The only other candidates off the top of my head that, if I had to come up with somebody, the only people that could even come close would have been maybe Sigourney Weaver, Charlize Theron, or maybe Julia Roberts, but they wouldn't have the chemistry with Bill, I think, that Helen did. Anyway, yeah, let's get into the movie now, huh? Yeah. Straight up, I fully admit to nostalgic bias here. I fucking love this film. Love everything about it. The premise, cast, music, score, writing, the effects. They just don't make disaster movies like this anymore. It's one of my favorite films of all time, even outside the bounds of its genre. I don't know how many times I've watched it. It's made me laugh, cry laughing, get on the edge of my seat, and just make me love filmmaking. It's up there with Jaws, Jurassic Park, or Tremors in terms of media, and even to an extent up there with Wizard of Oz in terms of media that influenced me so strongly from an early age, and including by traumatizing me. Just like with those other films, with the exception maybe of Oz, I was way too young the first time I saw this. Twister marketed itself as being from the creators of Jurassic Park, and while it may not be a horror movie, at least not first and foremost, I would argue it absolutely has horror elements and is probably still the best executed piece of media I've seen to date that sells the horror of the elements as well as the age-old narrative of man versus nature. It's an inherently just powerful movie. The Wizard of Oz may hold the crown for the best tornado seen to date in a movie, but Twister, in my opinion, is the quintessential movie about tornadoes. Like in Wizard of Oz, the Twister is just a background catalyst for Dorothy to get to Oz, where most of the effort and heart in the movie is focused. You could make a case that Oz itself was the true star of that movie, at least from a production standpoint. In Twister, you may feel differently about this, but from my assessment, the tornadoes for however little screen time they have compared to the humans, are the star. Pretty much every facet of the production is focused around them, the human characters' actions, relationships, and in most of the characters' cases, their backgrounds are all directly influenced by their occupation of studying tornadoes. To date, I've yet to see any other piece of media that puts as much character into the tornadoes themselves throughout the story. If you know of one, please tell me in the comments. But yeah, from the opening sequence onward, this movie goes out of its way to just thoroughly scare the hell out of you with a deep, unadulterated dive into what these storms can do. Tell me, how many of you were either scared of this movie, at least the tornadoes in the movie, as a kid, or knew someone who was? Is it like, you can't tell me this has nothing in it comparable to a horror movie when you look at how many people this thing made scared of tornadoes. And I love how it takes a page from the beginning of Jaws by not showing you the first twister. Its arrival is built up. We see glimpses of that wind, swirling outside the storm cellar window, which why the fuck does a storm cellar have a window on the door? But for most of that intro, you only hear it or see a little bit of it. When 5-year-old Joe watches her poor dad, played by a Richard Lineback, get sucked out of their cellar along with the door he was holding, I remember freaking out on the inside, knowing this could actually happen. Once I figured out, yeah, tornadoes can do this. One time I watched it with my gran, and one funny memory I have is her almost yelling at the screen when Joe's mom, played by, I swear this was the name that came up in the credits, Rusty Schwimmer, when the dad's screaming how he can't hold the cellar door shut, it said something really loud like, "Get over there and help him, you bitch!" As a kid, I agreed with her. I thought the mom was so selfish and cowardly to basically just let her husband die like that, like as she and her daughter watched. Now, as an adult, I realize it wouldn't have made any difference because the door was going to fly open the moment he let go of it. Like, those hinges and that little pin lock or whatever it was not going to hold. Like, I've seen people bust those locks open in public, school restrooms or just general public bathrooms. Like, that is not going to hold against an F5. So even if she had left Joe with her little dog for a second to try to help him, best case scenario, the twister would have ripped the door off anyway. They both would have been too close and likely gotten sucked up. Little Joe would have tried to go after them, gotten herself killed, and maybe only Toby would have survived because a dog would instinctively know that you don't run into what may as well be a fucking miniature cyclone. Director Jan de Bont did not hide his Wizard of Oz influence at all for this film, from the storm sensor packages being named after Dorothy to 5-year-old Joe in the beginning having a dog named Toby, who I believe was the same breed as Toto, a Cairn Terrier, if I'm pronouncing that right. De Bont also took some cues from Alfred Hitchcock, such as in the early shot of Bill driving out to meet Joe with Melissa, and you see that crop duster flying in beside his truck in the background. That shot was a very deliberate reference to 1959's North by Northwest, and De Bont says in Twister's DVD commentary, which I encourage you to watch after seeing the film for the first time if you somehow have never seen it. The commentary has some interesting stuff that makes a second viewing feel like its own entertaining experience, a nice back-to-back viewing. I love watching quality movies that I've already seen with the creator's commentary over them. It's always a cool way to get some insights into the creative process and some nice trivia straight from the horses' mouths. Fun fact, I cannot believe I didn't know this until rewatching this film for the podcast and seeing the name in the end credits. The little girl who played 5-year-old Joe, that's Alexa Vega.
Carmen Elizabeth Juanita Ecosca Brava Cortez.
Yeah, Spy Kids. From what I found, this was her third film role. She was born in 1988, so she would have been 7 to 8 maybe when this was filmed. As many times as I've seen this movie, I can't believe I didn't already know this, or if I did, I forgot. Like, I remember this last time rewatching, I thought, where have I seen that face before? I was head over heels for Spy Kids. I saw the first 3 in theaters. Alexa was awesome as Carmen. Just add this to the list of reasons she's awesome, I guess. She looked an F5 in the eye before she hit puberty. But yeah, I think this was my first ensemble cast movie. It introduced me to a few people I've since watched in many things. Besides Helen Hunt and Bill Paxton, there was the equally late and great Philip Seymour Hoffman playing my second favorite male character in the cast after Bill, Dusty. God, did Hoffman make me laugh playing this character. He was so much fun. He's so full of just boundless enthusiasm. A disposition sunnier than Grady Hoover from Tremors 2. He worships Bill almost to the degree of a cult.
Oh, manly handshake ensues. How you doing, man?
I swear he's like the big brother or the eccentric uncle I never had. His smile and energy are just so contagious. He's so easy to like. I would 110% grab a non-alcoholic beverage and hang out with this guy. He can be a bit over the top at times, and he's definitely a bit creepy with Melissa, depending on how you interpret it on the surface. But I choose to believe that it all comes from a good place. I always interpreted that as him just being naturally friendly to the point of obliviousness. Like, he knows she's Bill's fiance. He seems like a stand-up guy. A little surfer bro energy. For me, he never goes so over the top that I don't enjoy every second he's on screen. And there are points where he shows he can be serious and read the room enough to not be goofy, jokey all the time. He's just a guy who unapologetically loves what he does.
Oh, man. This is the fun part, sweetheart.
He loves his life, his job, and his friends. I vibe with that. I respect that. Aside from him, there's Rabbit, played by Ferris Bueller's old punching bag, Alan Ruck.
Rabbit is good, Rabbit is wise. Mother of God. Christ.
It's funny how they nickname him Rabbit, but when we first see his buddy Sanders, played by Sean Wallen, and he's the one wearing a Bugs Bunny shirt. I don't know if that was intentional or if maybe the costume department didn't entirely think it through, but I personally would have introduced him in the shirt. I won't name everybody, but there's a real sense of found family between Joe's team. That they're like the weird kids in school who all kind of got together over time and formed this band of misfits that maybe not a ton of people initially believed in. They're low on grant money, their vehicles are kind of beat up, their equipment doesn't always work, doesn't look as sophisticated as what's used by the, quote, corporate kiss butt Jonas Miller, played by Cary Elwes. This might be the first thing I saw him in before I first watched The Princess Bride and Saw. But point being, it's a well set up, solid underdog story. God, but poor Melissa Reeves, Bill's fiance, played by the gorgeous and funny Jamie Gertz. I still feel so bad for her character. Like, she gets the short end of the stick every which way plus Sunday throughout this movie. She serves as the audience conduit, the one with no experience in storms or chasing. Almost all the exposition is given to us through her asking the kinds of questions everyday people would.
Wow, it is great. What is it?
And she's not portrayed to be really a great or bad person, and she's not over-characterized in either direction, morally speaking. She's just a person, very nice, very down-to-earth. The most unusual thing about her is, I guess you could say, her occupation, but she exists mainly for 3 things in this movie. 1, like I said, to be the audience surrogate. 2, to be Bill's rebound, who, whether she likes it or not, is basically set up as Joe's competition, even though they're very civil to each other in all their interactions, never confrontational or catty, I would think, which paints Joe in a decent light as well. I'm glad they weren't written to be openly antagonistic toward each other, even though they throw hints of shade behind each other's backs, like real people definitely would, in their positions. But even then, you could argue that Joe talks about her, behind their backs more often than the other way around. And most importantly, Melissa exists to be physically and mentally tortured at every turn, like an innocent child who asks to visit a theme park and then gets strapped into a ride they were not prepared for at all. Well, after which they nearly die multiple times as this ride just gets relentlessly crazier and deadlier with just increasingly more safety code violations.
You know what, honey? I find this kind of interesting. I'm going to tag along.
2 hours later.
No, I'm not okay. This is not okay. Okay.
She has no idea how in over her head she is, and by the end of the second act, she's not only thoroughly traumatized, I can only guess, she then has to watch her man, through no fault of hers whatsoever, gradually go back to his ex. I mean, he flat out says, even though he doesn't know she can hear him over their radio, that he still has feelings for Joe. He tries to walk it back later, but Melissa ends up left single, going back home alone, and just basically fucks off out of the film. And even test audiences, Jan de Bont says, thought the plot was a little too cruel to her, or like the story could have been a bit kinder to where she ended up. You know, to her credit, she tells Bill when he's begging her to stay, trying to walk back how he was with Joe before, that it wouldn't have worked out between him and Melissa anyway in the long run. There's not really a nice way to leave your fiancé for your ex. I just think they tortured her a little too much. It's like, maybe I'm overly sympathetic. Like, that's just, I have a very empathetic personality, but she'll never set foot in Oklahoma again, I'll tell you that. God, this whole movie pretty much did for Oklahoma what Jaws did for the ocean. Man, people have been asking for decades now, including people who worked on the film, when is there going to be a sequel? Where's Twister 2? And I personally hope they never make a sequel. I don't see a need for it at all, especially so many years later, and after multiple people involved with the original are gone. Like, it definitely would not be the same fundamentally without Bill Paxton to add chemistry with Helen Hunt. But if they hypothetically did, I would love to see the first teaser trailer say something like, just when you thought it was safe to go back to Oklahoma. The song says there's not enough rain in Oklahoma during storm season, some might say.
Bullshit!
Nothing against people from Oklahoma, of course, but even today, I probably wouldn't accept a free vacation there either if it's storm season. Like, I'm sorry, Route 66 is a proud piece of American history to go through your great state, and let none speak ill of your chicken fried steak. But if it's summertime, especially April through June, I'm staying the fuck out.
Hey, if you don't like Oklahoma, then you can get out.
Please don't have me, Oklahoma. I really mean no offense, I swear. Obviously, with so many people in the cast, even with almost 2 hours of runtime, not everyone can get a lot of screen time, let alone equal development. I do feel like they could have given more to Haynes, the one other female team member besides Joe. She's played by Wendell Josepher, and yes, she gives off plenty of energy in the, I think, 5 lines she has that you can hear. So some of the dialogue, people are talking and yelling over each other, to sell the urgency of the situation, but I liked her. I liked her hat and loved her big glasses. She made me think of, like, Velma from Scooby-Doo if she decided to take a different career path. Yeah, and that's a compliment, Wendell, to be clear, because I always personally liked Velma more than Daphne growing up anyway. Her kind of brother-sister dynamic with Belzer was nice. She just got kind of lost in the supporting character shuffle, along with Sanders and Lawrence. Maybe you could have cut 1 or 2 of them from the cast. I don't think they were all necessary to the crew or the story. The team could have been a little less bloated, but I definitely would have kept Haynes. But like I said, the Twisters may not be shown as much as the humans, but they are very much the star characters here. I hear so many people bash on the tornado effects now. I've said before, we are so spoiled, and a number of us have become kind of snobby when it comes to CGI in the current generation. And the whole industry's become so oversaturated with CGI over time. Countless people really don't appreciate the tremendous effort and meticulous detail that went into every shot of this movie. And this was only a couple months or so before Independence Day released the same year. Or this was just 3 years after Jurassic Park, 1 year after the first feature-length computer animated film Toy Story. These films were all milestones, of course, but Twister was the first effects-driven film, probably since Wizard of Oz, to try to push effects technology as hard as it could go at that point in the mid-90s and make the most convincing tornadoes people had ever seen for what was now becoming, the digital age. You're not working with dinosaurs, aliens, or sentient toys. This is something real that still exists and still happens in real life. For this film, Industrial Light and Magic, the software engineers not only had to come up with a way to construct a digital Twister in ways that had never been done before. I'd highly recommend watching the behind-the-scenes interview with how they developed the program for constructing these Twisters. They then had to figure out how to integrate and blend these effects into real-world environments, mostly the various locales of Oklahoma. And Jan de Bont's team planned early on to mix their shots of the digital funnels with real tornado footage, much like Jaws mixed real shark footage alongside the mechanical one. And de Bont talks in the DVD commentary about how his team made every effort to ensure that this film would be as close to scientifically accurate as they could get, while balancing that out against the effects that were made more for entertainment purposes and required more suspension of disbelief. They consulted tornado experts regularly. They had scientists on set almost every day to get their 2 cents on, how this would play out, or how this shot would look from this perspective, or how they could make this look while still serving de Bont's creative vision for whatever scene they were on. They tried to make the film at least quasi-educational for general audiences who, knew nothing much about tornadoes, despite the story obviously playing with ideas that had no real-world references or expertise, like, what specifically the inside of a twister would look like, how the physics would work for certain ideas and sequences. Like, we watched this movie in my 9th grade earth science class, and when it gets to Bill and Joe being so close to the F5, which in the movie I think they say is at least 300 plus miles per hour wind speed with this mile-wide wedge, as you see in almost every movie tornado, like the wedge funnel is used so much more than the thinner rope funnels, I think. Yet that close, they're somehow outrunning it without the wind picking them up. Even as a kid, when it gets to them anchoring themselves down to those pipes with the belts, the funnel passes over them and that wind speed doesn't tear them in half or at minimum crush their bones and organs against the pressure of those belts. I've read accounts of twisters so strong that they sucked up a bunch of cows. Like, I read this one account, all these poor cows got sucked up, and their bodies were later found by farmers, I think just all around different parts of the area, with their skin and fur peeled off. That's what strong enough wind speeds can do to you, and you're telling me this F5 isn't strong enough to break a few belts and pipes? My earth science teacher pointed this out, and most of us in class, I think, were like, we know. It's like blowing up the shark in Jaws. I was like, I'm no expert, but even before I saw the Mythbusters episode that conclusively settled, the scientific accuracy on that, I was like, I'm no meteorologist, but this doesn't seem like what would actually happen. And that, just like I'm no scuba diver, but I don't think oxygen explodes to that degree, like you packed C4 inside the tank. This is still, at the end of the day, a Hollywood movie. Just like with Wizard of Oz, even after 57 years of technological and scientific advancements, there was still inevitably going to be a lot of educated guesses or just making stuff up for a film like this. But people can be really unfair or just straight up ignorant and or condescending when it comes to judging these effects, but because DeBont's crew put so much thought into every shot, every detail, every frame of these digital assets, and how the cast would act out scenes with all of these imaginary storms going on. The actors really did a great job, Helen and Bill especially, at making me believe these twisters were really there most of the time, and however much DeBont's intentions translated on screen, I think the impact of the final product overall speaks highly to them. This was 6 years before people started, bagging on the Star Wars prequels for the cast having to act against a CGI Yoda. There was so much more involved by comparison in having to pretend these huge storms are bearing down on you. Well, no offense to, the actors' performances in the prequels with CG Yoda, but there were a lot more parts at play with this film, I think, in terms of having to act against something that's not really there. And a big part of what facilitated that illusion, made the actors' performances so believable, was these big, expensive, even by modern standards, practical effects going on alongside the digital twisters almost every moment they're on screen. And I love the detail of how much more intense these environmental effects get the closer you get to the funnels. So, these actors had no exaggeration, tons upon tons of real shit being thrown at them, sometimes from multiple directions at once. Like you thought Judy Garland had it bad with all that wind and dust in The Wizard of Oz. This movie took everything she had endured for that one sequence in 1939 and basically dialed it up to 11 and on and off for about, what was it, like an hour and 40-something minutes. I'm talking industrial grade wind fans, ice machines which had to be refilled every take, raining hundreds if not thousands of pounds worth of ice, large and painful chunks of ice just coming down in waves, hitting these actors on the head, in the face, huge amounts of sticks and leaves being thrown to be blown by the fans, which sometimes would get caught in the actors' mouths or eyes. They're coughing so bad that they can't get their lines out. It was such a physically demanding shoot, with how many takes they had to do in one day sometimes just to get a couple to a few minutes of footage where everything went correctly. The wind fans made it so loud that Helen and Bill, for instance, couldn't hear any instructions during the really effects heavy scenes, like when they're hiding under that little bridge in the ditch from the first twister we see them go up against, the F1. DeBont had to have Helen and Bill wear these little earpieces that they had to be small enough that you don't easily see them in camera, so he could direct them on how to act. He's playing the role of the non-existent tornado, telling them when to move, how to react, all while they're dealing with all this wind and shit blowing in their faces. And you can point out how Helen's hair or Bill's jacket don't always look like they're blowing the right way. You can find a lot of little things like that, and I'll just respectfully request once again, shut up. Just the work ethic to get these scenes right, or at least convincing, thing is admirable, especially considering that they always worked hard to keep the animals safe. That they made sure not to harm any of the on-screen horses or birds. No cows were harmed or slaughtered in the making of this film. They did model a real cow for that flying CGI one, and yes, it is 1996. It is obviously a digital cow, but considering what they had to work with at the time, that's a pretty decent looking cow. It's just incredible work ethic all around. This film only had a $92 million budget, which sounds like a lot to, middle class folks like the majority of us. But even adjusted for inflation today, that was not a ton of money when weighed against how much DeBont wanted to do for this production. This was an incredibly ambitious film. The vision for the scope of this made Jurassic Park look small by comparison, and so much of the budget went into just simulating the tornadoes and debris. They went to Oklahoma during storm season hoping to get a bunch of tornado footage. I think DeBont said there was some storm activity before shooting began. Helen Hunt shares in an interview, this is her words, "One day we were in a van. I don't remember where we were going. It wasn't during production. It was before we started. Somebody said there was tornado activity close by. I never saw one with my own two eyes. But he said we're going to get out of the van now, and there was a ditch nearby. It was hard for me to understand how being in an 8-inch ditch could help you, but I'm not a tornado expert. So we were just listening to whoever was driving me. And the thing I remember was that the sky really does go a sick color green, like a nauseating green. And the barometric pressure changes, so your body feels all wrong so quickly. I remember feeling sick, and then it passed."
Going green. Greenwich.
One thing I learned during my research for this episode was that, to this day, supposedly, scientists don't conclusively know, or at least don't all agree, on exactly why the sky turns green like that. That color doesn't always mean a tornado's definitely about to happen. Not everyone who sees a twister will see that color, but it is generally a bad sign for storms. I don't recall seeing any green in the sky at my grand's house when that twister came near us. It's possible that maybe it was yellow, very slightly green. I only recall the yellow. There are multiple theories on how this color change happens, but I don't know what the current consensus on it is. Any meteorologists in the comments, again, please let me know. Once they started, though, once shooting began, not one twister that whole season, and apparently. So yeah, they put so much work into adding sky effects mixed with whatever real storm footage they could get from wherever. Then on top of that, you have expenses for the crew, on-location filming, licensing to use real footage sometimes from across other states. Like, I think parts of Kansas and Texas were included alongside the shooting in Oklahoma. The weather in Virginia, where I live, is known for how it can change on a dime depending on the time of year. Apparently in Oklahoma, it changes on a penny, so you'd get the actors with a backdrop of overcast clouds one minute and a clear blue sky the next in the same area. And this was, evidently a nightmare for the editors who were trying to keep some consistency between shots, so the audience didn't think the film was changing locations every other take. It's tough to keep continuity when the conditions around your environment are changing so frequently. It's like, imagine editing an almost 2-hour cohesive film out of that. There's a shot that the DVD commentary points out in one scene where the storm chasers are on the road. It's so quick and dark. I never would have noticed it myself, but for a second or two, according to whoever pointed this out in the commentary, you can see a Texas road sign pass by in the footage. It's like so quick. There's no way, like, I'm so immersed in the movie, there's no way I would have paid attention to see that. And they didn't have time to digitally alter the sign's font, so that's one little, blink and you'll miss it kind of hidden flaw. Then on top of all that, you have however much was spent on building destructible sets. They found a real abandoned house, or I think a recently sold house, tore the whole thing down with hydraulics beneath it, I believe. You can watch Bill Paxton walking cameramen through the set for what would be, I believe it was, Aunt Meg's house. It was either that house or the model for the one that he and Helen drive the truck through in the third act. I think it's the second house. Well, that shot is one part digital house and the other part a real fucking destructible house. They built that drive-in during the F4 sequence just to wreck it with all those cars and that big neon sign. You've got so many digital assets flying around so fast. It's like that. I believe that tire frame or plate, whatever it was, that that slices Preacher's forehead. I'm pretty sure that was digital.
Headshot.
But it's all moving so fast that I still can't always tell what's practical and what's not. The people watching the movie for the commentary don't even always remember anymore. It's just so much shit going all over the place. But yeah, as much as I praise how well the effects hold up and how much, work went into them, I will say the best shots of the funnel clouds are admittedly when they're either obscured or placed a fair distance away. I love how the camera shakes in scenes where the characters are driving or running, because, unlike in a lot of other action movies or found footage where that shaky cam can be so over the top and that it just immediately takes me out of the immersion, that this is the worst in fight scenes when they do that, since I can't fucking follow what's going on. In this movie, I think it's balanced just right to where it's shaky enough to feel authentic to how a camera would actually be moving when you're driving at high speeds, chasing storms, or running that frantically, especially the dash cam shots when you're driving on those bumpy or country roads. It also often helps hide the obviousness that the tornado is CGI at least a little. Add to that all the debris, what the actors are doing, all these different elements in certain shots come together to help sell the illusion to where your brain's taking in so much information that it likely won't focus on the funnel cloud as much. The best shot of the film for me is during the drive-in sequence where the darkness hides the F4 and we only see the funnel in moments where lightning flashes around or behind it to show the edges of the wind swirling. Like that I could almost believe was real. Now, the scariest twister in the film for me, at least in terms of the entrance it makes, is definitely the F3. It starts when Joe's crew are following it on Bob's Road. Their equipment tells them it's there, but for the first couple minutes or so after getting onto its path, they can't see the funnel.
We don't have a visual. Repeat, we do not have a visual. Help us out here.
Where is it?
That is terrifying to me. The idea of a twister that you can't see and you don't know exactly where or when it's going to drop. It not only builds the anticipation of the threat, it also stokes your imagination of like, oh my god, the last few twisters were already deadly enough, and they're getting progressively stronger. It's like a shonen anime. This is one of the most appropriate executions I've seen on the kind of story where the stakes just steadily escalate, and you're just like, God, after those first couple twisters, but what the hell is this next one going to be like? You see those dark circulating clouds, all these signs like nature couldn't be saying any louder or more clearly.
Oh, bitch, get out the way! Get out the way, bitch! Get out the way!
They're building this thing up to sound so much more ominous than the previous ones. And you all are driving right into it. Like, I can still remember the goosebumps I got the first time. Like, I was on the edge of my seat in suspense at this part. We're used to seeing a lot of sky beams, portals, giant planet-eating supervillains that change the weather around them, and, crazy weather events in general with superhero films. And not just that. Even before that, you got the Death Star or Star Killer base in Star Wars. The alien ships coming through the atmosphere in Independence Day. Then you get into the more superhero stuff with the Avengers, Suicide Squad, The Amazing Spider-Man, Big Hero 6, both the original and 2016 Ghostbusters. There's again, and before the superhero craze, then we get into the more recent stuff with Man of Steel, Justice League, Fantastic Four, Rise of the Silver Surfer. If you want to go back to the 2000s, this trope's gone all over the place. We poke fun at it now. It's become such a tired cliche at this point to expect something of that nature to happen that signifies imminent climactic danger coming down upon us. We see some form of this in almost every major superhero film or every other big spectacle action movie now. Twister made this kind of event look, sound, and feel 10 times darker and scarier than anything I've seen in Marvel, DC, or any other movie. Like, just the kind of hyping that would make any sane person run in the other direction. A portal in the sky with an army of aliens or monsters or lightning coming out of it. Yeah, all of those are kindergarten compared to the F3s build up in this movie.
That's no moon! It's a space station!
This whole sequence just throws so much at you. The clouds, the hail, the debris, that CGI boat, power lines going down with sparks flying, a fucking explosion. I had never seen that. Never thought that was possible before first watching this as a kid. Like every twister before was a warm-up.
Are you kidding? This thing's not over. We've only seen the start of it.
It's not nearly as much as we get in the third act, of course, but for about I'd say roughly the second act finale of this movie, like, this thing is a boss.
They're in the barricades!
And the scariest part of this whole scene, the back building, oh my god, as if a giant dark wind funnel wasn't enough, you had to go and make it start disappearing and reappearing like fucking X2's Nightcrawler.
It's back building!
It's not through yet! We got a jumper here!
The idea of being in the middle of that, those black clouds swirling, not knowing when it's going to jump back down, just, oh my god, I don't even want to think about it, I don't want to think about it. Again, I had so many nightmares about this as a kid. It's like the equivalent of dreaming you're lost at sea, you spot a shark fin, wondering when or from where it's going to come at you. Just nope, all the nopes, every nope. And every time you think it can't possibly get any bigger or crazier, somehow this movie always finds a way to throw something new at you. Like when the F4 that comes rampaging through the drive-in before the storm chasers or anyone even has a chance to prepare for it. I loved that detail of the funnel approaching from behind the projector screen playing The Shining. That was actually the first time I saw that scene with the twins and what the hell is the kid's name? I always get his name mixed up with his dad's. It's like there's Jack and Danny. I think it was Danny. Yes, it was Danny. Little Danny seeing those twins in the hallway. Again, this would have been when I was very young, like years before the first time I watched The Shining. That scene got stuck in my head with those flashes of the little girls just standing there, and then you switch to seeing their massacred bodies. Twister was responsible for that. And right as it gets to Jack Terrence chopping his way through the door, that's when this far greater, far stronger real-life monster just turns the whole screen with his face into splinters like it's nothing. Yeah, it's like, fuck you, Johnny, this is my movie. If we could have voices for each of these twisters, like if someone could do an edit of the whole movie with like voices dubbed over all the tornadoes, I'd have this F4 voiced by Alonzo Harris from Training Day.
King Kong ain't got shit on me!
Now, in daylight shots where the camera holds still and you see the tornadoes up close, yes, admittedly, it is immediately obvious that they're CGI. The worst offender is that widescreen shot that holds on the grand entrance of the F5. You can clearly see, even with those dark clouds, how it's swirling in a very consistent, manufactured-looking way. Real tornadoes don't move that perfectly for that long. I'm honestly not sure there is a way to completely get around that with digital effects. Again, I think Wizard of Oz had a much better approach from the outset, trying to do it practically. Twisters are just kind of a paradox in that it takes such specific conditions to make them, and there is a structure to how they form and move. But the visual itself, the funnel's just constantly changing shape down to such minuscule levels, and the movement in real life is so unpredictable and erratic that the dust cloud colors, lighting, surrounding storm movements, and debris, it all gives that funnel cloud such a unique profile. I just don't know if it's possible, even with current technology, to ever perfectly emulate that. I mean, you're talking about emulating probably multiple trillions of particles to get these such intricate little eccentricities in how the wind moves. It's just such a complicated meteorological machine with so many different parts at play, and you have to be careful not to make it look so good that it becomes even more obvious that it's an effect. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but there's a gray area between looking too fake and too pretty. There's a roughness to real tornadoes, real storms in general, that you have to find a very particular balance with when you're trying to, recreate it digitally. It's like you look at you look at the progression of effects technology when it comes to water simulations and how far we've come with that. That's easier to do by comparison, in my opinion, due to the fact that, liquid is a more solid, tangible thing compared to wind. Like, it's just very difficult to simulate wind or air, or especially in action heavy or fantasy heavy. Hey, there's a lot more imagination you got to put into it when it comes to the texture and kind of the wavelengths of the movements, I guess. But again, I will defend this film on grounds that, considering this was the first time a movie had ever really tried to do this to such a detailed degree, it was a hell of a first attempt. And the fact that this gigantic storm is happening in broad daylight, that's not as unrealistic as you might think. There are actually pictures and video of real twisters being spotted under a variety of different skies off to the side of the funnel. It depends on what side of the storm you're seeing it from. But yeah, there are storm systems where you can see what looks like, the end of days on one side and then beautiful blue sky right next to it. Like, that does happen. Now, what really gives the most character to these tornadoes for me isn't even how they look at all, it's the sound. Like, DeBont talks about how they recorded so many different noises and animals. What one of them he said was pigs. Very much like with Jurassic Park, their sound team just started messing around with these animal sounds, playing them backwards and experimenting with volume and pitch, and you hear something different with almost every twister. Sometimes one funnel cloud starts with more low growling that builds up to roaring like a lion. Those waterspout sisters that Joe, Bill, and Melissa get caught between, I'm almost positive that's the same sound as what they used for Jurassic Park's raptors. Like, if it wasn't the same sound effect, I think it was very similar. And again, considering this movie had the creators of Jurassic Park working on it, that wouldn't surprise me at all. If you've heard this sound before, you know what I'm talking about. It sounds very much like a shrieking pig mixed with nails on a chalkboard or scratching a sheet of metal, almost like how you imagine a banshee screaming. That pitch is edited just really high, and when the water spouts dissipate, you hear a washing sound, like the water those funnels sucked up from the river or wherever it was is all dropping back down. There's a lot of creativity to it when you take into account how much of this is guesswork, imagining what a twister would sound like that close up. Because obviously with real footage, at least all the video I've seen, you can't hear what the funnel would sound like in that much detail. We certainly don't know for sure what the inside would sound like, but I think the sound helps compensate for whenever the CGI shows its age, because it adds so much to the horror factor in making these already dangerous-looking storms so much more intimidating as you listen to them. You can really get chills at points from how guttural it sounds, imagining the power of those wind gusts as the funnel gets closer to the characters and imagining yourself in their position. Even without the movie, if you just close your eyes and listen to the sound alone, it really goes the extra mile to sell that primal tension and danger factor. And of course, I have to gush about the soundtrack for a minute. This movie runs the emotional gamut with its original score. I love the composition Mark Mancina did for it. It just seamlessly establishes the mood for each scene. And I love how the orchestral chorus rises and falls when the tornadoes are on screen, just to further accentuate their almost godlike stature. My top favorite tracks would be the following. Again, like with how I cited the Dawn of the Dead remake's OST in our first episode, I'm just reading what these are titled as, so in no particular order, my top tracks would be Wheatfield, Waterspouts, Cow, House Visit, The Big Suck, and end titles. But of course, I cannot talk about the music without mentioning the rock tracks. I tell you, this film made me look at Storm Chasers like they were rock stars, man. And in some ways they are. And a big part of that, I think, apart from their aforementioned legitimate badassery, is the rock songs used. Like this movie, along with 1995's Mighty Morphin Power Rangers movie, which I did see in theaters. Thank you very much, Dad. These two movies got me into Edward and Alex Van Halen. Rest and rock on in peace, Eddie. In Power Rangers, it was the song Dreams that plays in the finale with the fireworks. In Twister, it was Humans Being. And Respect the Wind, perfect song choice for the end credits, by the way. And that guitar in Respect the Wind is just, I can't even articulate very well into words the place it takes me to mentally. That instrumental is just on another level, man. And to this day, when Humans Being plays as Joe's crew and in their little convoy are driving after the next tornado, oh my god, I love that scene. And they bring it back playing at the very end for a couple to a few seconds, so you can barely hear it that time, when the crew ride up after Bill and Joe survive the F5. Just perfect. And full disclosure, I wouldn't call myself an avid Van Halen listener. Like, being honest, I haven't heard nearly as much of their stuff as other more veteran fans likely have. Never saw them in concert, sadly. I'd say I've listened to my fair share. I remember music in itself better than I can recall song titles, lyrics, or artist names. Generally, that's just how I've always been wired. It comes down first and foremost to whether the sound resonates with me. That's what generally leaves the most impact on me, but a lot of Van Halen songs that come on the radio, there's a good 50-50 chance I may recognize it. In terms of which song from them makes me the most nostalgic, though, Jump is number 2, Humans Being is number 1. That chorus of Shine On, it just lifts me up every time, man. Ugh, love it! Apart from that, Twister opened me up to a few artists, Stevie Nicks, Shania Twain. What's kind of unique to me about this movie, though, is that most of the songs are either in the background, sometimes to the point where I can barely hear them, or they're playing in-universe on the radio or something, and you'll hear the characters turn it up for maybe a minute or so before it's turned off, like that awesome sequence with everyone playing songs on top of each other to get pumped for the chase. You say, God, every time I watch that, man, and it just, yeah, however bad of a mood I'm in, that there are just some scenes you watch in movies and they just instantly take you back to how you felt the first time. And one last thing I'll say about the original score, one bit of music always stuck with me and still makes me feel a bit, every time I hear it. It plays several times from beginning to end. Anyone who's seen Twister enough times probably knows what I'm talking about. It's the first bit of music we hear when the studio logos are coming on screen and in the very beginning, and then we get that brilliant and horrifying opening title sequence. I swear if this movie had been 3D, I'm not sure I could have finished it as a kid. Definitely not in theaters. I didn't see it in theaters to begin with. That would have made my nightmares much worse. But, yeah, the 3D would have made me shit my pants in the seat. It's one of the best constructed opening titles I've seen. And, I'd honestly put it up there with like, the opening credits to Star Wars and Superman, and that is a high bar for me. And Richard Donner's Superman, I mean. And it immediately gives you a virtually perfect impression of like, this is what you're in for, I hope you're ready. It's like the climb to the top just before your first drop on a roller coaster. Now, moving on, like we talked about before, that there are points in dialogue where the main cast project onto the twisters with words that anthropomorphize them, like in the family dinner scene or lunch, whatever time of day it was, where the group drop in on Joe's Aunt Meg, played by the lovely Lois Smith. Like, I loved that actress so much in this movie. She reminded me a little bit of my grandmother on my dad's side. Mom's side it was Gran, and dad's side it was Grandma, and they discuss the Fujita scale, named after Dr. Tetsuya Fujita, an important man. He actually lived to see this movie come out. He died in November of 1998 at age 78. They call it the enhanced Fujita scale now, since it was updated in 2007. So instead of F1 through F5, now apparently it's EF1 through EF5. I still call it Fujita scale out of habit, and with twisters, I still instinctively say F1 through F5. I know that's not the up-to-date terminology, but I'm too set in my ways, and I personally just don't entirely, like, no offense to meteorologists, I just don't entirely see why you need to say the E. Like, I think most people know you're speaking in context of whatever the current data is when you refer to the scale. I mean, most people aren't going to say it while thinking about whatever the current criteria is on wind speed or damage. It's like, systems of scientific data are updated all the time, aren't they? Like, of every year, but you don't hear enhanced or updated being tacked onto all of them when we say them aloud. It just becomes the new norm, the most up-to-date version. And maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I mean, feel free to disagree with me in the comments. I just don't think it's a huge deal how you say it either way. But it's sort of unintentionally funny watching it now when Melissa innocently asks, is there an F5? And everyone goes quiet like this woman just said a slur or Voldemort's name out loud or something. It's like they're in a Western saloon and someone just slammed on the piano keys. One of the team members, a preacher, or appropriately enough, describes the F5 as the finger of God. As a kid, I thought for years he said thunder of God. This was VHS or TV. I don't think we had subtitles for movies back then. And finger of God sounds so much better. That's just chef's kiss writing. Whichever of the screenwriters came up with that line, they deserved an Academy Award just for that. Just the dialogue throughout this film is just so well written. Paced out and delivered. Jan de Bont mentions that some of it was done by Joss Whedon. And remember when he wasn't so divisive among fans? And Kathleen Kennedy was a producer on this movie. God, remember when everything she had her hand in turned into a pretty much universally beloved banger? And like I said, when we encounter such an incredible, seemingly godlike force of nature, it's almost inevitable that some part of our brains will characterize it in these ways. This is most strongly displayed with Jo, as we learn that the trauma of losing her dad not only made her obsessed with chasing these tornadoes, but caused her to perhaps unconsciously humanize them to a degree that borders on delusion.
You've never seen it miss this house and miss that house and come after you.
Christ, Joe, is that what you think it did?
And again, that's understandable why she'd feel that way, even though it obviously sounds illogical when you say it out loud. It's often human nature to project like that. I actually really like this as a facet of Joe's character because it's a common trope in media for scientist characters to be colder, more clinical, more logical than, just your average Joe or Jane, and not very in touch with their emotions maybe, or just emotionally suppressed. But this adds more layers to it, because however smart you are or whatever technology you have, you're not always going to view everything logically, because fear and trauma are not logical. So I appreciate the nuance that a scientist like Joe, who studied these things long enough to know they're not literal living things, could still, after all she's been through, harbor this fear and maybe hatred towards them that she's never really gotten over until presumably after the events of this movie, or at least she's started to heal from it. And those feelings may always be a part of her to some extent. It's not as simple as curing a disease, as people with PTSD in real life have told me. You carry scars from it forever. We should do an episode talking about, the horror of war sometime, and as well as PTSD. But you can heal to a point of regaining control of your life and identity, and that's one of my favorite aspects of Jo's arc. It's a story about facing, accepting, and overcoming trauma that this character's avoided really dealing with for most of her life, at least in a healthy way. It's heavily implied in Jo's dialogue with Bill that this may have likely contributed to their marriage failing in the past, because maybe they just never really talked through this before, or Bill didn't really make enough of an effort to listen to her perspective on that. When I first watched this as a kid, I initially thought Jo was kind of crazy or perhaps a workaholic, but that scene where Bill finally calls her out on her unresolved issues after all their previously more comedic bickering, it totally recontextualized her character and their relationship for me, because who knows how I would have turned out if I lost someone I loved the way she did. That was one of my first examples as a young kid of seeing how childhood trauma can affect you later in life. Like when you're a kid, you're brought up generally to believe that adults have everything together, they're what you aspire to be, they have all the answers. And this was my first example of seeing how that's not always the case at all. Well, it's the most powerful human moment of the film for me, and the peak of Helen's dramatic acting in it, because it instantly made me really feel for Jo. We see that she's not some unrealistically capable or nearly flawless Mary Sue or constantly badass larger-than-life superheroine. She's human. And the icing on the cake was after she and Bill barely save Aunt Meg and her dog, you see Jo's confidence really break for the first time as she questions for a moment whether she can keep doing this, which makes the emotional payoff that much greater when Meg, Bill, and her friends all help her pick herself back up and get back out there, even though it's hard. It's a great example overall of how to do a second act low point well, and in a way that doesn't come off to me as contrived or overtly formulaic. I'm gushing about Helen again, I know, but she really makes this movie for me and sells what is just such a strong and relatable arc for a lead protagonist, male or female. Well, and I'll end this on one more quote from her, as she really sums up the tone de Bont went for, or with like I talked about with how tornadoes have been revered in real life. That's what this movie was intended to convey. And as Helen perfectly sums them up, whether it's a monster coming at you or a force of nature to be listened to, fascinating or terrifying, it's all of those things. Okay, now that I've spent about half this script just writing a love letter to Twister, let's get into
Suck Zone.
And here to help us hang on for dear life through the suckage is 2014's Into the Storm. So yeah, remember what I said about how Twister is one of those movies I really don't think needed a sequel? Yeah, this movie is basically unofficially that. If you want to hear more detail on just how much Into the Storm has in common with Twister, I recommend checking out the video 24 Reasons Twister and Into the Storm are the same movie from the YouTube channel Couch Tea. It's a partially kind of comedic comparison, but he spits some facts. And much like Twister unapologetically references Wizard of Oz, this movie references Twister among possibly other disaster movies involving tornadoes. I can't confirm that, whether it's intentional, but it's mentioned in IMDb's trivia for the film, though I generally take that site's information with a pinch of salt. But unlike Twister, which integrated such references organically into its own universe, this movie flat out copies several of the same story and character beats with no semblance of subtlety. It tries to replicate multiple things Twister did cinematically to, in my opinion, a lesser result. And does pretty much everything that I praised Twister for not doing. It's literally just a bigger, more expensive, and ultimately inferiorly executed spiritual reboot, sequel, requel, whose delivery lacks the same level of heart and humanity as Twister. When I said they don't make disaster films like that anymore, this is a perfect example to illustrate how the way the industry approaches these kinds of movies has changed. So this was Sarah Wayne Callie's return to the big screen after her character Lori Grimes had just been killed off at the time on AMC's The Walking Dead TV series. I cannot believe that franchise cow is still standing after how many years straight they've milked it. And I don't think anybody predicted it would have become such a Goliath for making zombies more mainstream than they've already been. But possibly more than they've ever been, since 28 Days Later and the Dawn of the Dead remake resurrected their popularity in the 2000s. There is a line during Sarah's interaction with two of this film's recurring characters, Donk and Revis, and we'll fucking get to them, where they're sitting around drinking in the middle of a town that's deserted once the tornadoes have started. One of them says it looks like something out of a zombie apocalypse, and that may or may not have been an intentional reference to Sarah's past role on The Walking Dead. I don't know. Interestingly, we have two other actors here in supporting roles who, shortly after this film, the next year, I believe, would go on to play characters in the still ongoing spin-off Fear the Walking Dead, which started chronologically as a prequel to the first show's events, going back to the early days of the zombie outbreak before Rick woke up in the hospital. You have Alicia Debnam Carey as Caitlin, the love interest to one of this movie's main leads, and Scott Lawrence, who plays a high school principal both here and in Fear the Walking Dead. Hey, typecasting isn't always the worst thing, a paycheck's a paycheck. And Sarah stars as essentially a less compelling and, in my opinion, frankly, less interesting equivalent to Joe Harding. Our main protagonist, Allison, and I hate to say this because I like Sarah as an actor, she was perfect casting for her character in The Walking Dead, and I genuinely saw Lori come to life, right off the page of the original comics whenever she was on screen. This movie did no favors for drawing attention to her acting. Her character's full name here, I believe, is Allison Stone, and she does unfortunately come off at points like Stone in terms of her emotive range. She's playing a scientist who studies tornadoes in more of a background role, not really the same kind of field work that gets as physical as what Joe and her team do. She's always in the van, similarly focused on her work. They try to give her an empathetic side with a little daughter she hates being away from for so long, and she does try to help people as the film goes on, saves lives. But she's just so clinical and two-dimensional, not as expressive. At worst, just kind of milquetoast. And I don't blame Sarah for that. Again, I've seen her do better. I blame this on the direction, some of the other cast members she has to bounce off of, and this script just not giving hardly any of these people much to work with in the way of being relatable. It sounds like an emotional script on paper if you just listen to the dialogue in a vacuum. But in execution, for a movie, it just falls so flat across the board. The performances here basically fall into one of two categories. You either have characters that are so wooden or generic in performance and given such by-the-numbers dialogue that they sound very much like characters in a movie, whereas Twister's cast acted and sounded more like real people to me, with their emotional delivery and eccentricities lending themselves to make their performances come off more authentic. Or in the second category, you have a few characters so ridiculously over the top, trying way too hard to be serious, dramatic, or funny, that they sound even less like relatable people and more like cringy cartoon characters written for what feels like a different movie altogether, like more of a parody or soap opera. This film was written by Josh Swetnam. I don't know how many versions of this script there were, or if it went through multiple screenwriters. You can tell sometimes when it feels like there were too many cooks in the kitchen. But the thing is, like I said before, Twister spans varying genres and subgenres too. It's dramatic, funny, romantic, action-packed, suspenseful, scary. It runs the whole gauntlet, even if it is foremost a dramatic disaster thriller. But with that movie and its multiple writers, to me, the script still comes across like a cohesive, united experience where everything fits. The film keeps a consistency in its identity from start to finish. I did not get that feeling from Into the Storm at all. This movie comes off like it went through an identity crisis where however many hands there were in the screenplay, they just couldn't agree on what it was supposed to be. Perhaps studio interference played a role as well. It just seemed like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. I've heard multiple film critics say something similar, like Jeremy Johns, who's at least a once popular film critic. I haven't kept up with a lot of his stuff recently. That balance just isn't there between this film, trying to be serious or emotional at some points, then funny, then thrilling, and what have you. And you combine that with the inconsistent mix of acting styles, which, I'm sorry, again, no shade to the cast. I did not believe a single performance from these characters. They sound like something out of a Lifetime, ABC, Disney Channel original made-for-TV movie. And I've seen made-for-TV films better acted than this. The secondary protagonist, Gary, played by Richard Armitage, I could not take him seriously because he just acted so self-serious, like an action star, always trying to be so dramatic that it comes off unintentionally funny at points. Like he is very much like a soap opera type character to me. His eldest son, Donnie, isn't much better, though he does try. His younger brother's played by one of Nickelodeon's old child actors who managed to escape the long-reported horrific abuses of Dan Schneider. iCarly's Nathan Kress rocking this just hilariously ugly hairdo that looks like the hair and makeup department envisioned this high schooler fusion of young Justin Bieber and Leon Kennedy. The script gives him such cringe dialogue. It's one of those movies where the people involved clearly didn't know how teenagers talk, and he's written like such a little creep too at points, like when he not so stealthily films this conversation between his brother and the girl he likes, Caitlin, and without her consent. Pretty sure that's a felony, by the way. Had nothing to do with filming for their graduation ceremony. That would not hold up in court. This film's constructed like a found footage documentary. I don't know how that would make it in without him getting in trouble with the authorities afterward. The worst offenders for me are Donk, played by Kyle Davis, and Revis, played by John Reap. So, remember what I said about how Philip Seymour Hoffman's delivery as Dusty kept a quality balance between being funny but not too over the top and knowing when to tone it down when a scene called for it? Yeah, these two painful redneck stereotypes are the opposite of that in every way. To some people, they're the best characters in the film. For the life of me, I don't know how, except maybe to kids. To me, they're just so annoying, cartoonish, just consistently obnoxious every moment they're on screen. Literally, every time they showed up and opened their mouths, it took me out of the film. And there's such an infrequently poor sense of timing to when they come back in after something serious or maybe tragic just happened. And, again, Jeremy Johns pointed out in his review for this movie how these two struck him as like a redneck equivalent to the backlash that Skids and Mudflap got in Michael Bay's second Transformers movie, Revenge of the Fallen. And I would agree, but even Skids and Mudflap, I cannot believe this film is driving me to defend them. At the very least, they were cooler to watch. They're still transforming robots with pretty decent, effects working in their favor. Or they were more interesting to look at, even when their voices and dialogue were grating. Like, I'd watch a whole Transformers spin-off movie starring those two before I ever sit through the shenanigans of Donk and Revis again. And I'm all for providing some levity in a disaster flick. Twister did it right because it had a better script and cast, to be blunt. And I don't know who thought that characters like this would improve this movie, let alone who thought they were so funny that they approved having them appear throughout the story. Thankfully, they never stick around long, but the total screen time they are given was still too long for my taste. They're portrayed as this, I guess, caricaturized commentary on those kinds of shoestring budget daredevil YouTubers, you know, these amateur Evel Knievel and or jackass imitators who do stupid stuff in their mom's backyard and put on these cringy performances trying to get views however they can. A lot of us have probably seen or maybe even used to follow a YouTuber like this. They're attention seekers who go out in their rusty old truck, filming themselves trying to get footage of the tornadoes with no protection, but one of them, I forget which, wearing a motorcycle helmet, I think, with a camera on top. And these independent storm chasers do unfortunately exist in real life. You know, they want their 15 minutes of fame so badly that they're willing to put themselves and occasionally potentially people around them in danger while sometimes interfering with professional storm chasers' work. You know, I can understand the concept of having people like that or representing that in a big budget tornado movie. I can only assume that they kept these characters in so long because they might have been well received by test audiences during post-production. Which, you know, if that's the case, that's just one of multiple reasons that I, like quite a few people who actually work in the industry, you know, writers, producers, etc., believe test audiences are a fundamentally flawed, far too often ineffective, unreliable, just outdated idea that shouldn't be used to gauge how any media is made anymore. That's another discussion altogether. The one scene I will say that legitimately got a laugh out of me from these two is when they're filming near a twister in the background, cheering about how huge this is going to make them. We're going to be YouTube stars for the rest of our lives. And then another vortex comes in from off screen where they weren't looking, picks up a donk, I think, who's wearing the helmet camera. And it looks like it just fucking yeets him into the stratosphere. It's like if this were a slasher movie and the tornado was the killer, just jumped in and it just exited the two of them from the movie. Had this script kept the screen time of these two to a minimum and exited them from the plot with that scene more quickly, like the moment they show up and try to do what real storm chasers do, just instant karma, that would have been fine. I think that would have made them far more tolerable and potentially more of a benefit to watching the movie. That's my take. Sadly, that's not what happened, and they are tragically revealed to have survived at the end. The movie ends on them because, that's what people wanted to see in the finale, I guess. I guess it's true what Jackass always preached. If you're going to be dumb, you got to be tough. If it, as I said, this film was conceived very early on as a found footage tornado thriller, trying to present like a documentary covering this storm outbreak from the point of view of several different characters, different vantage points. It mixes in real storm footage, weather report audio, and I think takes very loose inspiration from true tornado events. And I will say, I don't dislike the idea. Found footage can work for this premise. It could have lent another level of authenticity to the illusion of these newer digital storms. Unfortunately, the illusion shoots itself in the foot as we get far too many shots that make no logical or technological sense for how they would have been filmed or who would have been filming that at that exact moment. You have these blatantly cinematic, overly professional-looking aerial shots that I don't think a weather crew would be able to get in that much crisp detail from a helicopter. That the camera stays far too still at points, like a cinematic wide shot, when it would be more realistic to have at least some shaky cam. And when there is shaky cam, it overstays its welcome while making it more difficult to follow certain scenes that are already framed in a cinematic way. It's like some scenes there's no shaky cam when it would benefit, and then when there is, there's way too much of it. They never find that balance, and in which case, I start thinking to myself, if you're going to have some of these shots be so cinematic, then why try to make it look like found footage at all when your cinematography and framing is already working against that illusion so many times throughout? Like, what is the point of doing a found footage movie if you're not going to to have consistency with its tone or format. And exactly like I pointed out with Twister, the spectacle of this film works against its immersion when we get all these pretty, obviously staged cinematic shots of these CGI tornadoes that show them on screen for far too long, way too close up, thereby exposing how clearly CGI they are, except this time is so much more egregious, specifically because the digital effects have so much more put into them to show off the spectacle. And right there's your problem for this whole concept. Why would you want to do that for what's supposed to look like a semi-realistic fictional documentary? Twister marketed itself as a spectacle-driven cinematic disaster flick. So those big, grand kinds of shots that you know and couldn't be captured in found footage made sense. Like, it was designed and presented like a Hollywood movie. We're used to seeing shots like that in movies that are shot to be presented like movies. So it's a different context trying to get immersed in that compared to this. Found footage should never do that, in my opinion, under any circumstance, because the very nature of its genre doesn't allow for that if you want it to look like authentic found footage. Even in scenes where cameras are set up on a tripod and they're stationary, so it makes sense why they would be still, at its best, there's still that grainy, homemade feel to it. Even with advanced, like, security cameras, is that you can always tell when it switches from a camera someone could realistically afford to shoot this stuff on their own to like a $100 million budget film production in a grade kind of camera that you know, I don't know, whatever kinds of cameras they're using now to film the Avatar sequels or the Mandalorian or whatever. Most people on average do not have cameras like that. That's kind of implied in why it's called found footage. You can't suspend disbelief as easily, at least I can't, when it looks so blatantly overproduced. This is not the kind of framework you want for a disaster film whose marketing appeal is meant to be the scale and entertainment value of the effects. You can't do both here and expect a tenable balance, not when you're showing your effects off this much and we're meant to believe it as something happening in the real world. It's like, you know, pick a lane, either make it a spectacle-driven movie like The Day After Tomorrow, or make it like different people filming this stuff outside their houses or in their cars with whatever kinds of cameras your average middle-class person could afford from, I don't know, Walmart. And there are some amateur filmmakers who have more complex tech available to them, or maybe they save up for it, I understand that. But even Cloverfield or Troll Hunter were smarter about how much of the effects they showed or how they framed it. And those are fictional monster movies. Just like in Twister, the most realistic shots of the funnels are usually when they're obscured, kept at a distance, and not shown for too many seconds at a time. This is the inverse of all of that. Like, what the hell were the people in charge of these decisions thinking? Again, how many cooks had their hands in this pot? This film was directed by Stephen Quayle, who has worked a number of different jobs to varying degrees of importance in a few movies. He worked on The Abyss, Titanic, Avatar. His most notable directorial credits were on 2005's Aliens of the Deep and 2011's Final Destination 5. So yeah, make of that what you will. He has commented on his respect for storm chasers, and this film could be seen as a tribute to that. He states in interviews how, like with Twister, they consulted real storm chasers among other experts for production. One of their main consultants here was Reed Timmer, a quote, extreme storm chaser. That's what they're called officially today, I guess, who hosted the discontinued Discovery Channel show Storm Chasers. I swear, Matt Walsh's character in the film, this film, Pete, may as well have been a self-insert for this guy. They look so similar, work in the same profession, and even use similar vehicles, which I'll touch on shortly. But yeah, Quayle consulted him on multiple things throughout development. He picked out references for what types of tornadoes would be in each scene, Quayle. So the effects artists would work to translate what Quayle picked out as closely as they could with reference video on the left and the simulation on the right. VFX supervisor Colin Strauss said, quote, "One of the most complicated things with making a tornado digitally was first establishing that visual language of what type of tornado we were matching to." My favorite shot in terms of entertainment is the fire tornado. Those can happen in real life, such as with forest fires. Storm chasers have observed vortexes sucking fire up the funnel. They're also called fire whirls. Of course, this 100-foot-high funnel is a whole other ballgame. Some meteorologists I've watched who reacted to scenes from this movie have pointed out that it would probably take a lot of fuel to make even a thin twister of that size and height to light up like that and maintain the flames for that long. And you also have to account for the humidity level in the air, surrounding temperature, etc. It's very much, I would say, the second most Hollywood shot of the film. It's also funny how you notice when the funnel passes into the area of the flames, it just inexplicably stops following whatever its damage path was and stays right in that spot, in that one spot, because that's where the fire is. I'm no expert, and again, tornadoes can be very unpredictable, but I don't think they usually stay in one place like that for that long. Like in every video I've ever seen, once they touch down, they're constantly moving in some direction, even if it's slowly or only over a short distance before the funnel shifts. I've never seen or heard of a vortex holding stationary like that, except, again, in controlled environments, like with water or wind fans. And they used wind fans to try and make a practical fire whirl on set by blowing the fans at these flames at different angles, trying to form a swirl. From what's been talked about in this film's behind-the-scenes stuff, they tried multiple times to make it happen practically. It just didn't work. It's very difficult to recreate the exact conditions necessary for any vortex, let alone different types of vortices to form. They're very particular. And the biggest pro I can give to this movie is the practical effects. Pretty much everything they did to create the storm conditions and debris in Twister, Into the Storm did that with even more tools and toys in the arsenal. Just like Twister's cast, these actors were pummeled by fans, water, leaves, sticks, ice, the whole 9 yards, plus an extra for good measure. The cast said it was punishing at points, but a very fun movie to make. Sarah Callies and Nathan Kress had a blast, pun 100% intended. So props to them. I'm glad they enjoyed it. I've said before, even if a movie completely bombs critically or financially, I can respect people who at least had fun doing it, because, you know, what is the point of making entertainment, like I've said before, if you don't at the very least have fun with it? It's to a point. A lot of different artists from a few different VFX studios all work together in their own departments for the digital effects in this movie. I'm not going to cite them all. I think there was like close to 10 of them in the credits. The main one I saw was hydraulics, I think is how they pronounce it. It's written weirdly in the credits. I don't know why they write it like that. Yeah, but I'm just going to call it hydraulics or hydral LX, whatever. And as much as I applaud their effort, I just have to call a spade a spade. 99% of these tornadoes, while they are more advanced and varied, do not look convincing to me. The film feels more like a glorified tech demo or a video game cutscene with real actors thrown in. And I sympathize with the challenges they must have had. I really do. But I could not suspend disbelief at any of these vortexes. The second that a scene holds on them, my suspension of disbelief breaks. Even the fire tornado, as cool as it looks, best death scene in the film. You know, poor Jacob, played by Jeremy Sumter. That fire is just so clearly digital. And I've seen digital fire look more convincing than that, even in older movies. The core problem here regarding how the technology executes these simulations, I think, is not a lack in detail. It's that these storms look too good. Normally, that's not a bad problem to have, but what I mean is that it looks too pretty, too, like I said, overproduced. The tornadoes look far too solid at points, even in conditions that shouldn't typically make the funnel's edge look so sharp. The wind's movement doesn't look dirty enough or blurred enough, and the dust and debris don't always help mask it as well as it did in Twister, because these funnel clouds spend so much more time on screen. The wind is often too tangibly defined, almost glossy looking at times. If you've seen what airbending looked like in M. Night Shyamalan's The Last Airbender, or the key attacks in Dragon Ball Evolution, and yes, I was unfortunate enough to have seen that in theaters. There was almost nobody in that room, but if you've seen that, it sort of reminds me of that. The effects don't look bad, they just look more focused on spectacle than realism, and this is most obvious in the much heavier, destructive scale. These tornadoes are ripping cement out of the ground, lifting dozens upon dozens of 18-wheeler tanker trucks. You have one scene with 5 separate vortices touching down, not in a multi-vortex tornado. These are presented like independent touchdowns within such a confined area, and they're all just dancing around in such close proximity to each other with no central vortex causing this that I could see. The Twister's waterspout sisters were more plausible. The EF 5, 6, whatever it was at the very end, the Super Twister is lifting up several airplanes, like 747s out of an airport and swirling them through the sky. And the most Hollywood shot, hands down, didn't even try to be remotely realistic, is the finale with the, quote, eye of the tornado. The Storm Chaser character Pete's mission is to get a shot of the inside of the funnel, which he does in the end after sacrificing himself to save the others. That was a nice redeeming moment for him, credit where credit's due. I guess we can count that as a character arc, even if Matt Walsh's material he was given just made him come off super flat to me for most of the film. And even when compared to how Twister had to imagine what the inside of the funnel would look like, this thing is ridiculous. It looks more like a hurricane made up of these dozens, hundreds of vortices swirling around the inside. It doesn't obey the physics of how tornadoes work at all. There's a bus on the inside of the funnel that stays on the ground while Pete is picked up and floated above the storm, like he gets a glimpse of heaven right before he's ideally sent there when he falls back down. It reminds me very much of when Neo and Trinity are flying above the cloudy, blocked out sky in the Matrix Revolutions, and it's you see them go above the cloud line into the sun, the real life sun, which I guess nobody has ever seen before, and they hold this for a moment with I think Trinity saying, "Oh, it's so beautiful," before they go back down into machine hell. It's every meteorologist that I've watched review this scene in particular straight up laughs at it, and I'm sitting here thinking while watching the movie, where did all that scientific consultation go here? And I hate bashing on the people that worked on this. I really don't mean to come off as a hater. Again, A+ to all the productions and effects artists for effort here. Or, they just did what they were told to do. The destructible sets were fantastic, the practical sets, and in terms of sound, the sound is really where it kills me. If you played scenes from Twister or Wizard of Oz in my ear with no music or dialogue, I could probably tell you at least half the time which tornado is which, and not just because I've seen Twister so many times, but because, again, most every Twister sound design had some unique character to it. Every Twister in this movie sounds pretty much the same to me. I didn't get that same sense of individuality or quote-unquote personality. It all just kind of blurs together in my memory as loud, windy noises. I will give one more compliment in that Pete's armored vehicle, the Titus, was cool. Extreme Storm Chasers have graduated to using armored vehicles like that, according to Reed Timmer at the time. That vehicle had more character put into it than probably any of the vehicles in Twister. It reminded me of Mad Max, Death Race, Twisted Metal, or Dead Reckoning from George Romero's Land of the Dead. My favorite detail was those extendable spikes that anchor into the ground. Reed shows in an interview with his own real armored vehicle how a version of those spikes are actually used for some armored cars in extreme storm chasing. I think they made the interior and equipment of the Titus look as much like a real storm chaser car as possible. The set decorator did a great job with that. And you see some of these real vehicles now all decked out with everything, even parachutes apparently, though Reed points out how it's most likely impossible to ever make a truly tornado-proof transport that can't be sucked up off the ground. That's just a fight you're not going to win. And Quayle comments on how the film makes us sort of not explicitly focused on, but hinted at commentary with how these real-life occurrences of increasingly more extreme storms over the past a couple decades alone now may be linked to climate change. Yeah, very much like how 2004's The Day After Tomorrow centered around that. Back then it was global warming. Now this movie basically goes, hey, what if we did that idea again, but just with the tornadoes?
Social commentary.
There's sense that, to a fair amount of people who have seen The Day After Tomorrow, the tornadoes were the best part of that movie, at least in terms of the disaster effects. And again, that's a real thing happening in Tornado Alley, especially these growing events with just unusually powerful supercell storm systems producing unprecedented numbers and strength of twisters, and sometimes these systems combine unexpectedly to form previously unfathomable windy titans, not entirely unlike the literal one from Disney's Hercules. These, according to Quayle, the EF5 in the film was originally 1 mile wide. Then a real 2.6 mile wide tornado happened in El Reno, Oklahoma. This was May 31st, 2013. Still the widest tornado ever recorded to date, as far as I found. Just an absolute monster of a wedge funnel. And this motivated both Quayle and the effects artist to then go back before production wrapped and make their last tornado similarly bigger for the finale. Twister admittedly did something similar, with Joe pointing out that the storm system in that movie was the first of its kind, especially with the F5 at the end. I think one of the storm chasers says that was the biggest twister on record, and in the movie it's basically like a dick measuring contest with the weather in these movies. Just this almost absurdly huge supercell wall cloud speeding up to I don't know how many vortices powering it again, like almost 300 mile per hour wind speed. In the movie it's over 300. It just, stronger, bigger, faster. You all know the Daft Punk song.
God, I miss them.
So yeah, Into the Storm. It's not terrible by any means. It's serviceable popcorn fun, just not a quality representation of the real terror of tornadoes, in my opinion. But very overtly sci-fi. If you want to watch a fun reaction to this movie from people who know more than I do about meteorology, you can check out the video from self-proclaimed weather nerd YouTuber Jaden Johnson on the channel Johnson TV. And with that, our time is up for this episode of Horror Convos. Comment below, are you scared of tornadoes? Have you ever seen one? What was your experience like? What's your top favorite and least favorite depiction of one in media? For all you meteorologists, what's the most realistic fictional twister you've seen, and what do most effects for fake tornadoes get wrong? Do you think technology will ever be able to perfectly digitally create one, as well as how Wizard of Oz did it, or even better? Don't be shy with your opinions. Remember, this is more than a podcast. It is a dialogue between horror lovers. Here is your regular reminder that Horror Convos is available to listen to on YouTube, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and ad-free on Patreon. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss when our newest content is uploaded. Good night. Be well until we talk again.